Welcome, everyone. It is great to be here with you for our LinkedIn Live, where today we are focusing on the critical role of character in leadership. Now, this is a live and interactive session, so if you have any comments, any questions, just want to say hello, please be sure to put your comments in the comment section of our LinkedIn Live. And we are going to try to get to as many questions as possible in the live Q&A portion of our time together. I am very excited to welcome our special guest. And our special guest today is Dr. Mary Crossan, who is the Professor of Strategic Leadership and Character Researcher at the Ivey Business School at Western University, also the co-founder of Virtuosity Character. She wrote the book, Developing Leadership Character, and is also a co-host of the Question of Character podcast series. Dr. Mary Crossan, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here, Rumeet. Thank you for having me.
I'm so looking forward to this conversation, even kind of in our pre-call, just what you have been sharing as it relates to character and how we view it is so fascinating. So we are going to get right into it. I've got a couple of questions for you. And again, to the audience, please pop in any questions, comments, just say hello in the comments section of our LinkedIn Live. We are going to get to as many questions as possible. My first question to you, Mary, is this. Now, we're talking about leadership, and we're going to start with a simple yet a little complicated question. And the question is, what makes a great leader?
Well, Rumeet, I think I'm going to just add to what I think a lot of people have thought in the past, that it's about competence or it's something about style, leadership style. I think really essentially what we missed is fundamentally about the character of the leader. And we got that mixed up a little bit with thinking about just morals and ethics, but really thinking about, as we're going to talk about in a little bit here, things like courage, humanity, and humility. And in many ways, I talk about this as really the aerodynamics of leadership. You think back at a time when we were learning to fly and we looked at birds and we were flapping our wings thinking that's how we fly. I think that's competence and also some degree leadership style. The aerodynamics is what we didn't see, which is the leader character. And that's the piece that we're keying in on. There's some engineering behind that we'll talk about today.
I've never heard it framed in that way, the aerodynamics, and I think that's brilliant. And this question of, what makes a great leader, when I'm doing keynotes and workshops on leadership or even emotional intelligence, I pose that question, and people fill out Post-it notes, and we have this kind of chart of all these qualities and characteristics of what makes a great leader. And interestingly, competence doesn't come up. It's that piece of courage, someone who's courageous, a good listener, someone who communicates well, all of these pieces, kind of the aerodynamics of leadership. So I'm excited to dig in deeper. So let's get into leadership character. How would you define that? And how has your own understanding of leadership character evolved over time?
When we got into this in 2008 with the economic crisis, we were looking at what were the failures of leadership and discovered that it was character as well as competence. At that point in time, we really discovered we were standing on the shoulders of giants, Aristotle, Plato, Confucius, big traditions around understanding character. And then Martin Seligman, former president of the American Psychological Association, looking at what are these dimensions of character that are actually universal across time, cultures, contexts. So whether you're in financial services or healthcare. To make a very long story short, it took us about 6 years of engaged scholarship, bridging deep theory with the practice of leadership to come up with these 11 dimensions of character that are observable and can be developed. What I think the listeners will get, and hopefully they'll get the attachment, which looks at those 11 dimensions of character. Judgment is in the middle, or what Aristotle called practical wisdom. And Rumeet, I think a key facet about character, which people did not understand when they started talking about, well, I think it's all about grit, or it's all about, courage, or it's all about integrity, is that they didn't pick up that any dimension of character, what we call virtues, could operate as a vice in deficiency or excess. And there it was, even an integrity operating in its excess state means that a leader will just be kind of dogmatic and rigid about how they operate.
It's almost overdoing your strengths, right? It could be a strength, but if you overdo it, it can actually work in the other way. And I believe the author you just mentioned, he wrote the book Flourishing, which was fantastic, and I read that a number of years ago. And so the definition or how we look at character leadership has evolved over time. And here at Women of Influence, we are interested in knowing, kind of from your experiences, are there any challenges that specifically women face in building and showcasing leadership character? But also not just challenges, are there opportunities on the other side of the coin?
Mm-hmm. Well, the good news is that, if anything, I think women are privileged around character. And the reason I say this is, and quite frankly, any group that has really been marginalized or in a system that was not designed for them. Because think about this, it takes a lot of character to navigate those systems.
Mm-hmm.
It takes a lot of judgment. It takes a lot of humility. It takes a lot of courage. And so in many ways, I think women have been cultivating these aspects of character all along, but not necessarily recognizing that that's exactly what they've been doing. And therefore, as we start to elevate character alongside competence in higher education and organizations, I think in some ways we could say we're leveling the playing field, because now we're going to attend to things that matter deeply. Here's some evidence. There's a 14% increase in leader effectiveness between weak and strong character, 10% increase in leader resilience, 8% increase in well-being, a 6% increase in promotion potential. And then if we look at the organization itself, things like a 16% improvement in psychological safety. So let's tie women back into this scenario about things. How safe have they felt in organizations to be able to raise issues? And that if we were working on the development of character, not just women, but all people in an organization, we'd be able to move the needle on all sorts of metrics.
I want to build on that, because you're talking about character and competence, and it reminds me of kind of the work that we do around trust, right? When you don't trust someone to do something, is it a character issue or is it a competence issue? Are they lacking the capabilities? Perhaps they need professional development or mentorship or support. And I think it does tie back into just exactly what you said right now, psychological safety. There are those connections to make. And now I want to build on what you've said, because you just slightly touched on the organization piece. How does focusing on leadership character transform an organization's culture?
I love this question because, having been in the strategy field for now close to 40 years, I've seen organizations wrestle with culture. And, it's new value systems, it's new, processes and new definitions, but rarely do they actually think about the character of the individuals in the organization that may manifest in ways that were unintended. So the basic thing that we say is that culture will be a reflection of the character of the individuals in the organization. So let's go back to the point that you were raising earlier. If we've, let's say, overweighted on things like drive and being results oriented and accountability and integrity, and underweighted on things like humility and humanity and temperance, which is your patience and calm, we've got already hardwired into the organization imbalances that will manifest into toxic cultures, failure to delegate, having the lack of psychological safety, et cetera.
Thank you for mentioning that. I do want to build on that, because patience, Mary, was not a virtue I was born with. I am not a very patient person, but when we think about this, when we think about character, what are some practical steps that our audience, including myself, can take to develop their own leadership character?
Rumeet, this is the $1 million question we always get asked, because when people start to look at character, so we treat it like the anatomy and physiology of the body, right? This aerodynamics, it's the engineering side. All right, we can understand what it is, how it operates. Now we want to think about how to develop it. So we typically talk about that as going to the character gym. And we want to be thinking about character. It's a habit of behavior, and that is either strengthening or weakening over time. We're always becoming something. So we could become more courageous or less courageous. And simply having an understanding of what character is can give us an awareness of whether we're strengthening or weakening something. It also helps us understand whether or not something might be operating in its excess state. And here's a very important point. If it's in the excess state, it's not like you want to tone it down or diminish it. It is that, so I use the example under judgment. I have a lot of decisiveness. It's rarely going to be in its deficient state, but that means it's likely going to operate in its excess state. People, I don't see that I'm impulsive, but would others see me as quick to make a decision about something? And therefore, Rumeet, part of the development is that not that I have to work on my decisiveness, but I have to work on the other dimensions of character to support it. So under collaboration, for example, being open-minded and flexible to be able to support the strength and the decisiveness. Now, we've got this kind of landscape that tells us what we need to do and how we need to do it. The actual daily development of it is as sophisticated as things like we developed an app, Virtuosity character, that help people go to that character gym every day. If you don't have access to the app, you can even look at things like there are free resources out there in terms of a LinkedIn account that gives some exercises about the development of character. We've got a Spotify playlist on using how music can activate character. So there's some very practical day in, day out things that we can do.
That is interesting. And to our audience listening in, just so you know, we've posted a link in the comment section that talks about all of the characters, the character that Dr. Mary Crossan is talking about right now. So you can access that in the comment section. Also, please feel free to put your questions into the comment section. We're going to get to as many as possible. Before I get to the first one, I've got one final question. Mary, just for clarification. So when we think about character, are we talking about who we are? Like, is that kind of who we are and who we bring to the table?
Yes, you got the nail on the head. So we often, because organizations, by the way, when we go back to culture, is you start to shift a culture too by thinking about, well, who are you hiring? Who are you promoting? What are you rewarding in an organization? And typically the competence is what somebody does or how they do it. And I think it's really important as you pick up, but who are we? Who have we become while we're busy doing? And by the way, this is also a great place to bring in all the equity, diversity, and inclusion, all the richness of the background that we bring to the table.
I love that you've mentioned that, because I wrote a children's book called Who Do I Want to Become? And as I'm listening to you speak about character and leadership, for some of us, we're still figuring it out. We're still trying to figure out who we are and who we want to be. And then you've got the piece about the organization, and the culture of the organization represents the character of the individuals. And it is a journey. It is a journey. And I think we change who we are as we go through different experiences, and doing that check-in and kind of saying, okay, where's my character at? And is what I'm doing aligned with my character and who I am? I think that's incredibly important and something that I'm thinking about. So thank you for clarifying that. We are going to go to our audience questions. Again, if you've got questions, comments, please pop them into the comment section. Let's go to our first one. Our first one are some, and this is just building off the last question that I asked you about developing our character, our leadership character. Are some leadership characteristics more difficult to develop than others?
So again, a great question. So there's some underpinnings to the development of character. There are four big systems: your physiology, your affect, which is feelings, emotions, and mood, your behavior, which is simply a lot about your kind of movement, and then your cognition. So much of our leadership development is focused on, well, if I just think it, I'll know it and I'll do it. Yeah. And so, Rumeet, the issue about what is more difficult to develop often depends on those underlying systems, how well we've learned to regulate them. So let's take temperance with its patience and calm. If you haven't learned to regulate that physiological system very well, it could be one that is tougher for you. But then let's go back to some practices. Like many of our listeners here will have done some things around meditation and yoga. those are areas where they are really targeted at a lot of that sort of breathing and physiological system. And they might find that, if they could link those practices to becoming more patient and calm, that'll be easier for them than, for example, somebody who hasn't got those practices at hand.
I love that. Looking at the physiology, I'm actually even thinking about that in terms of my almost 8-year-old son, right? Who is a little less patient like his mom, but talking about things like meditation and yoga and breathing and slowing down, I think is important, but we have to understand those systems. So thank you for that. Next question. In an organization, while authority and positions are created without biases to gender roles, they are usually taken over by men, which are followed by patriarchy trends. Apologies for that. What's your take on that? What sort of leadership practice do we need today to shatter the glass ceiling?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another good question. It's back to these systems, right? Whether it's society or organizations, they often have not been designed. They've been designed for the incumbents in the system. So, partly it's think about who have we rewarded and what are we continue to reproduce in organizations that may have undermined some dimensions of character and, privileged some and not the other. And quite frankly, I think a lot of women have opted out of those systems because they're going, I don't buy into that. That doesn't make sense to me. And they're right. And this, I think, has now been this course correction that we can look at and say, well, how are we going to elevate things like humility and humanity and temperance? Because it improves judgment and decision making. It does not undermine it. This is not a weakness. Some of these areas that people thought were weak, of course they're not. They're actually the exact thing that you need for the high performance we're looking for in organizations. So Rumeet, I think the course correction then is when organizations then realize that the performance and well-being that they're looking for is going to require them to elevate character alongside competence. I think we're going to see that kind of course correction that the questioner was asking about.
And I think you're right. For years, these were called the soft skills when they are not the soft skills. These are essential skills that are required for leadership today and for our workforce. So thank you for clarifying that. And I think it's incredibly important because it's not just the competence piece. We have to have all the other elements in there to have a workplace where there is psychological safety, where people are thriving and they're able to show up as who they are. Beautiful. Okay, next question. Could you share what a leadership character workout might look like?
Well, it depends which one you're working on, but I'll take transcendence, which I quite like. I call it the renewable energy of leadership. Transcendence, if you look at those behaviors, being appreciative, inspired, purposive, optimistic, creative, and future oriented. And how are you working those muscles every day? Like, what are you doing to feed? Think about this from a nurture standpoint. Well, partly you have to ask yourself even things like, what brings you joy? What is it that in your daily living, brings that sense of well-being into your life? In my case, it's nature. Nature is a very big thing. I look out my window. It's partly the decision about where I've chosen to live is to say, I want to imbue my life with the kinds of things that affect how I think about things. But you can also then start to use, as I've talked about earlier, music. So what is that music that might give you that uplifting feeling that transports you, beyond the mundane? There are things even like pictures and memories and poems that you could, put around you that cultivate and activate on your character to remind you in the midst of the hard day what you're about and what, to remind you of that kind of transcendent quality.
I love that you brought up nature because in our last LinkedIn Live last month, where we focused on mental health and in the workplace, we talked a lot about nature as well. And the things that you're mentioning, there's this fantastic book that I read about awe. and finding everyday moments of awe. And one of the best books I've read in a very long time. And it talks about this, right? Being in spaces and places that kind of take your breath away. And you can find that in everyday life and incorporating that. So I love that you're including that in the leadership character workout. But underneath that, it's also understanding yourself and understanding, I guess it goes back to our previous point of like who you are and what brings you those moments of awe. What are you going to surround yourself with, and what your environment has to look like that works best for you? All right, next question. We've got lots of fantastic questions coming in. Again, pop your questions into the comments section of our LinkedIn Live. We're going to try to get to as many as possible. How can we incorporate conscious leadership development in an organization like, say, the Marine Corps? A little specific there, but let's do it.
Yeah, what's wonderful about the character leadership work is these dimensions of character work in every single organization. And as you picked up earlier, Rumeet, personally and professionally. So we often pick up that parents go, wow, I had never thought about it this way. Now I've got a roadmap that helps me cultivate, even within my kids, the strength of character, because we talk about leader character as the disposition to lead, not so much. I mean, it's required in positions of leadership, but in today's world, we need the disposition to lead. Now, if I work with militaries around the world, and Rumeet, the thing that they all pick up on is that they have, in some ways, misunderstood aspects of character. They've overweighted some, they've underweighted others, and now there's an opportunity to course correct around that. So there's a lot of things that they got right, but there's these pieces that were not necessarily quite right. And I'll give you an example. Under humility, there's the word vulnerability. As we all know, Brené Brown has made just a nice living, right? Helping us understand the importance of vulnerability. In militaries, they were trained not to be vulnerable to enemies, not to be vulnerable to subordinates. And yet we know that if we don't have and cultivate the capacity for vulnerability in its virtuous state, how will we own up to problems and difficulties that we face? So that, I would say, is all of these dimensions of character, are applied to all organizations, and many need some course correction on this.
The course correction, it's also how do we kind of own up to mistakes that we make? How do we own up to the failures that we make? Because we're human and we do make those things. And that vulnerability piece is important, and regardless of the industry or the organization that you're in. Thank you for that, Mary. Okay, my next question that comes from the audience: what is the best way to determine where you currently stand in terms of your leadership character and understanding kind of what does need to be cultivated and developed?
Well, you can take a look at that handout and just, self-assess, take a look and start to, give your a sense of whether there's imbalances. But then going from there, there's the leader character insight assessment available through Sigma assessment systems in both self and 360 assessment. So many organizations use the 360 assessment to help guide and cultivate leaders around where their character is and how they develop. That particular assessment then yields a report that you can start to look at resources that get you on the journey for character development.
And Dr. Mary Crossan has graciously shared the PDF, which again, you can find in the comment section from our team. You can access exactly what Mary is talking about using that link. So thank you for sharing that with our audience. Okay, next question. I only have a few more minutes left here. I can talk about this forever. Gaining so much knowledge as it relates to this. Thank you. The next question is this: can you share any insights on leadership character and authenticity? What if some of these traits don't feel authentic to who I am or how I identify? Brilliant question.
Yeah. So authenticity being authentic is part of integrity. And as we take a look at integrity, those behaviors being authentic, candid, transparent, principled, consistent. Many organizations value integrity, but I say it's like telling somebody to run a marathon and not train for it. So the journey, as I think this, question is being posed, that behavior in itself and learning what it means to be authentic its relationship to other parts of the character framework become very important. So the vulnerability to be authentic, right? The courage it takes to be authentic. And I think then we start to see this connectivity between how individuals cultivate character and the degree to which organizations enable it, because in many cases, organizations have suppressed the very authenticity that people want to bring to the table. And that's, of course, a lot of what is in the EDI agenda.
They've suppressed the authenticity. I think that's incredibly powerful. Thank you. My next question is back to how leadership character is currently framed as soft skills. Does this branding, calling them soft skills, undervalue the importance of this type of skills development? I would argue, yes, it does. And how can HR leaders reframe the conversation? How can organizations invest in helping teams develop their essential skills? Great question.
Well, there's a simple saying that we have: wherever competence resides, character belongs.
Oh,
How do you elevate character alongside competence? Thinking about in your practices of selection, onboarding, performance management, who you promote in an organization. And I think this is absolutely a paradigm shift for many organizations and, quite frankly, higher education. Rest assured, we know a lot about how to do this. And so that this is not as daunting as it might seem. And we've written a piece in the Sloan Management Review, Making Leader Character Your Competitive Edge. And as a strategy person, I can assure any listener here, whether you're an individual or an organization, elevating character alongside competence will yield not only performance benefits, but also the well-being that goes along with that.
Can you repeat what you started the answer with? The beautiful quote about residing and character.
Yeah, wherever competence resides, character belongs.
Oh, I love that. Wherever competence resides, character belongs. Thank you so much for that. I've got one last question for you before we wrap up. Are leadership characteristics such as empathy and resilience developed through practice and experience, or are they innate qualities one must be born with?
Those ones in particular are not part of the semi-stable personality traits.
Okay.
Yeah, as you know, of those 62 behaviors of character, conscientiousness is one of the big 5 personality traits. But the simple answer is all of these behaviors can be developed, Rumeet. So that's just, I think, a really optimistic place for everybody who wants to work on developing character.
Beautiful. And again, we've got the PDF link in the comments section. Dr. Mary Crossan, this has been such a wonderful conversation. If you are not following Dr. Crossan, I encourage you to do so. You can find her on LinkedIn. You can check out her book as well, the book that she wrote, Developing Leadership Character, or her podcast series, Question of Character. This has been such a fabulous conversation. Dr. Crossan, thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. Thank you for your questions, your comments. It's been an absolute pleasure. I'm Dr. Rumeet Billan, CEO of Women of Influence Plus. We cannot wait to see you again next month, where we are going to be doing another LinkedIn Live. Stay tuned on the details for that coming out shortly. Until we connect again, please do take good care of yourselves. Dr. Crossan, Mary, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.